In 1973, a 21-year-old girl was brutally murdered in a parking garage in a bustling downtown area in the United States. At the scene, there was no murder weapon, no reliable eyewitnesses, and no clear motive. The only things left behind were a trail of blood spanning several floors and a bloody fingerprint, so incomplete that it was almost unidentifiable. Due to limited clues, the case fell into an unsolvable stalemate. In the blink of an eye, 1 year passed, 5 years passed, 10 years passed. During that time, the police investigated countless leads, and even thought several times that they were on the verge of success. But each time they were pushed back to square one. In the end, this case was sealed and became what everyone saw as a perfect crime that could never be solved. But no one would have imagined that 21 years later, a nearly forgotten bloody fingerprint would actually make the real killer have nowhere to hide. And the person who made all of this a reality was none other than Dr. Henry Lee, who would later be hailed as the Chinese-American master detective. So what exactly happened back then? Let's travel back in time to 1973 and see how this legendary cold case, spanning nearly 3 decades, was uncovered. Step by step, New Haven is located on the north shore of Long Island Sound, in Connecticut, and is the third largest city in the state. Many people's first impression of it is the world-famous university, Yale University. This Ivy League school with a long history gives New Haven a strong academic atmosphere, and also keeps the city in a quiet and peaceful urban environment for a long time, with clean streets, stable communities, and not much violent crime. But in 1973, a silent killing plunged all of New Haven into shock and darkness. The protagonist of the story was named Penny Sarah, a 21-year-old young girl. She was born and raised in an Italian-American family near Huntington Avenue in New Haven, with long black hair, a delicate appearance, and a gentle personality. When she was 11 years old, her mother Paula died of cancer. This sudden change made the already struggling family even more difficult. Her father John was a skilled auto mechanic who ran a repair shop in the Huntington Beach area. After his wife passed away, he had to be both father and mother. As the eldest daughter, Penny matured early and began to take on the heavy responsibility of being the big sister, helping her father handle the repair shop's bills and chores, and taking care of her younger sister Rosemary, who was 5 years younger. To Rosemary, Penny was like a mother. Over the next 10 years, the family of 3 supported each other and had a close and harmonious relationship. By 1971, Penny finally graduated from high school. In her yearbook, she wrote this sentence: "May the heart be free from worry and the spirit be joyful." People who knew her believed this sentence was a true reflection of her. She had a gentle nature, disliked conflict, and never argued with others. Even when occasionally offended, she would often just smile it off. To lighten the family's burden, she did not continue her studies after high school, but instead entered society early. She worked as an assistant at a dental clinic on Temple Street in downtown New Haven. The work was tedious and extremely busy, but she never complained and always had a warm smile on her face. In the eyes of her family, she was the most sensible daughter. In the eyes of her colleagues, she was the most reliable partner. In the impression of friends and neighbors, she was the kind of girl who would never cause any trouble. However, such a wonderful girl suddenly met with tragedy, plunging all of New Haven into shock and darkness. The date came to the 16th of July. That day was a weekday, and the sweltering weather made people restless. Penny took a day off specifically to handle some bills, and also buy a few pieces of furniture and daily necessities, driving her father's blue Buick, purchased in 1971. That morning, she even had a small argument with her sister. At around 11 in the morning, she drove that blue Buick away from home, stopping by her father's auto repair shop on the way. She sat there for a while and told her father that she was going downtown to buy some furniture and would be home after she was done. Her father John didn't think much of it and just reminded his daughter to be safe on the road. At 12:42 p.m., Penny arrived safely at the Temple Street parking garage in downtown New Haven. This parking garage, located in the bustling commercial district, had a total of 10 floors and was one of the largest public parking structures in the area at the time. People going to the nearby shopping centers would park their cars here. Every day, a large number of vehicles came and went. Since the first floor was almost completely full, Penny kept driving up and eventually parked on the 9th floor. Normally, after parking, she should have taken the elevator out immediately and gone to the nearby mall to run her errands. But strangely, from the moment she entered the parking garage, she seemed to have vanished into thin air, completely disappearing without a trace. By a little after 1 in the afternoon, Mike, a parking garage employee, was strolling back to his post after lunch when he passed through the 10th floor and suddenly noticed that there seemed to be something in the stairwell. He approached curiously to see what it was. As he got closer, the sight before him made him stumble backward in shock. A young woman was curled up in the stairwell, covered in blood. Mike called the police immediately without hesitation, and officers and paramedics arrived quickly, but it was already too late. The preliminary examination showed that the victim was about 20 years old and had just died recently, as her body temperature was still present. Her blue dress was soaked in blood, her shoes were missing, and there were 2 gold necklaces around her neck. She had multiple wounds on her body, with the most fatal being a knife stab directly to the chest, precisely piercing the heart, while the murder weapon was nowhere to be found. In addition, defensive wounds were found on her head, eyes, arms, and other parts of the body, which gave the police a glimmer of hope. Because, as long as there was close quarters combat, the killer was highly likely to be injured. If he was injured, there was a high probability he would leave traces. Next, the police conducted a floor-by-floor grid search of the parking garage. Soon, they found an unlocked, irregularly parked blue Buick sedan in Zone A on the 8th floor. Large amounts of blood were found on the exterior door handle, the car doors, and the driver's seat base. The interior of the car was in disarray, with a pair of women's slippers and a wallet next to the driver's seat. The wallet contained $14.75 in cash, and a parking ticket stamped with the entry time of 12:42 p.m. A blood-stained tissue box was found on the rear floorboard, and this is an important point to remember, as it becomes crucial later in the story. In addition to the inside of the car, there were drip-shaped bloodstains on the floor nearby. These blood droplets were not scattered randomly, but appeared to have been left by an injured person running while bleeding. This trail of blood extended from the Buick all the way to the 9th floor, and then to the stairwell on the 10th floor, and that was exactly where the victim was found. What is more, identical drip-shaped bloodstains were also found on the 5th and 6th floors. On the 7th floor, officers found a set of blood-stained car keys, which were later confirmed to belong to the Buick, and next to them, a blood-stained white handkerchief was discarded. Judging from this trail of blood spanning multiple floors, it was clear that someone had been significantly injured after the crime and fled in a panic, and this person was highly likely to be the killer. At this point, all the physical evidence at the scene had been collected. At the same time, the police traced the license plate of the blue Buick to the owner John, and finally confirmed that the victim was his 21-year-old eldest daughter Penny. When John arrived at the scene with his younger daughter and saw his daughter, who had been lively and full of energy just hours earlier, lying cold in a pool of blood, the old father collapsed on the spot, crying in heart-wrenching agony. Next, the technicians began conducting systematic examinations of all the physical evidence, taking photographs, making measurements, extracting blood samples, and collecting fingerprints. Every piece of evidence was carefully numbered and preserved. They successively recovered multiple fingerprints from the car, the handkerchief, and the tissue box. After comparison, they all matched Penny's family members, except for one blurred fingerprint on the tissue box that belonged to a stranger. If you are someone who enjoys watching true crime videos, your first reaction upon hearing this would probably be, doesn't this mean the case is solved? In today's criminal investigations, as long as there is blood, there is DNA, and combined with fingerprints, identifying the killer is indeed not difficult. But the problem was, this was 1973 when DNA technology was underdeveloped and had not yet been used in criminal investigations. At that time, the only thing they could do was the most basic blood type analysis, which couldn't identify the killer, and even for such a simple test, it took a long time back then, so the police could only wait patiently. As for fingerprint comparison, computer technology was not advanced at the time, so comparisons were done entirely by hand using magnifying glasses, one by one. It was estimated that just comparing 1 million fingerprint records in the surrounding area would take 52 years, an almost impossible task. On the other side, as the case was reported by the media, all of New Haven quickly fell into panic. In broad daylight, in the bustling commercial district of downtown, a 21-year-old young girl was brutally murdered inside a public parking garage. This was unheard of to the public. Since the killer was still at large, panic spread rapidly. Girls were afraid to go out alone, and all of New Haven was enveloped in an oppressively tense atmosphere. The police, under unprecedented pressure, could only continue their investigation. Since there were no surveillance cameras at the time, the first step of the police investigation was naturally the traditional door-to-door interviews and canvassing for witnesses. Soon, several seemingly important clues surfaced one after another. Bill, an employee of a nearby department store, said that, while resting in the parking garage at noon, he had seen a young man with black hair and a mustache following a young woman into the 8th floor of the garage, and the woman's figure closely resembled Penny, though regrettably he hadn't gotten a clear look at the man's face. Another witness provided an even more chilling account, saying he had seen a thin, small-built white man holding something shiny in his hand, chasing a woman from the 9th floor toward the 10th floor, and a few minutes later this man returned alone to the 9th floor parking area. The toll booth attendant also provided a detail. Just after 1 p.m. on the day of the crime, he had received a somewhat damp parking ticket with a red mark on it. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but only after the case broke did he realize that red mark was likely blood. Unfortunately, the toll system at the time was very primitive, only recording entry and exit times without registering the driver or license plate number, but he vaguely recalled that the license plate contained the letters R, and the driver was a thin, small-built young white man with long black hair who spoke with a foreign accent. Although these witness accounts were somewhat vague, they were the only leads the police had to work with. Next, the police began a full-scale search for suspects, but where to start? Anyone familiar with solving cases would know. Naturally, they started by looking into Penny's inner circle. Because as the old saying goes, when one partner is killed, the other becomes a prime suspect. So the police first focused on Penny's ex-boyfriend Philip. Philip was 7 years older than Penny, and at first the two were deeply in love and even got engaged. But as time went on, their conflicts escalated, with big arguments every 3 days and small ones every 2 days, until Penny eventually called off the engagement and broke up with him. Although it ended badly, interestingly, they still traveled and spent time together occasionally after the breakup. Coincidentally, on the day of the crime, Penny had originally planned to meet Philip. The police thought, isn't this obvious? His suspicion was just too strong, so they immediately summoned Philip to the station for questioning and obtained a search warrant. Sure enough, they found a pair of blood-stained scissors in his house. At the same time, witness Bill positively identified Philip as the man he had seen chasing the young woman. Now, with both witness and physical evidence in hand, it seemed the case was about to be closed. But just then, one heavy blow after another caught the police off guard and brought a shocking reversal to the case. As many as 12 witnesses testified that Philip had been busy at his family's restaurant throughout the time of the crime and had never left, giving him a solid alibi. Further investigation revealed that witness Bill had gone to the parking garage that day to secretly smoke marijuana, so his mind may have been impaired, making his eyewitness account completely unreliable. As for the blood-stained scissors, they were later confirmed to have no connection to the case, and just like that, Philip's suspicion was completely cleared, and the investigation returned to square one. Time quickly passed to October 1973. More than 3 months after the crime, the Connecticut State Health Laboratory finally delivered its findings. 2 blood types had been collected at the scene, type A and type O, with type A belonging to Penny and type O obviously coming from the killer. And those drip-shaped bloodstains from the 5th floor to the 7th floor, and all the way up to the stairwell on the 10th floor were all the killer's type O blood. Through analysis of the blood droplet distribution, police determined that the blood had come from the killer's left side. That is to say, during the fierce struggle with Penny, the killer had been stabbed in the left hand or left arm. However, the killer was type O blood, and the killer's left hand was injured. These 2 clues, while significant, could not directly identify the killer. The police had to shift their focus and try to find a breakthrough in Penny's social relationships. But after going through her circle, they found that her social connections were extremely simple, and there was no one worth suspecting. Combined with the fact that the cash and jewelry in her wallet were untouched, and the victim had not been sexually assaulted, the possibilities of premeditated revenge, killing, or crime of passion were basically ruled out, leaving only one analysis: a random attack. The killer might have acted on impulse, intending to commit sexual assault, or he might have been targeting Penny's car. After all, in the 1970s, car theft was rampant in America, with many criminals specifically targeting vehicles in large parking garages, waiting for the owner to leave before stealing the car. This kind of motiveless random crime was precisely the police's worst nightmare. And so, with no new clues emerging, the case inevitably fell into a stalemate. Penny's father John spent his days in tears and sleepless nights. To catch his daughter's killer, he went to the police station almost every day to check on progress. After learning that the killer's left hand might have been injured, he even became a detective himself, driving around the streets of New Haven every day, staring at the left hands of passers-by, hoping to spot the demon. Not only that, he also began placing reward advertisements at his own expense in major newspapers, like the New Haven Register, telling everyone he met about his daughter's tragedy, hoping for tips from anyone who knew something. Later, he even hired private investigators, but nothing came of it. Under John's relentless pressure, the police never relaxed their efforts. But in that era of technological scarcity, with only so much evidence available, there wasn't much they could do. In desperation, they even turned to the supernatural and consulted a psychic. The police found a relatively well-known local psychic named Mary. Mary said that the killer might be an auto mechanic and that it was related to someone, but that was all she could offer, and it was of no help to the investigation. In fact, the police had found freon, a chemical commonly used in auto repair shops, at the crime scene, and they had also checked nearby auto repair shops, but found nothing. And so, as time went on, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years passed, and this once city-shaking murder case gradually faded from public view, becoming a cold case that no one cared about anymore. The only one who never gave up was John. For him, the rest of his life had only one goal left: to find the person who murdered his daughter. He contacted the police station every single day without fail, and placed newspaper ads at his own expense. But none of this helped move the case forward. A full 11 years had passed since Penny was killed, and the case had made no progress by this time. Almost everyone at the New Haven Police Department felt that there was probably no hope left for this case to ever be solved. And just then, a breakthrough appeared. In 1984, a woman named Melanie came to the police station angrily to report her ex-husband Anthony for domestic violence and death threats. Importantly, Anthony had said this to her: "I'll deal with you the same way I dealt with Penny." The police immediately became alert. Could this Anthony be the killer they had been searching for all these years? This man was somewhat of a public figure in the local community, having been a star pitcher on the school baseball team in the past, and later serving as a baseball coach. So the police decided to investigate quietly without tipping him off. Their inquiries revealed that he did indeed have a connection to Penny. The two had dated and had argued before, and he had been in downtown New Haven around the time of the crime. Even more coincidentally, he had a 2.5 centimeter scar on his left hand, and his blood type happened to be type O, fitting every condition perfectly. At this point, a surge of excitement ran through the police force. For 11 years, they felt for the first time that they were so close to the truth. So they formally arrested Anthony and charged him with murder. The news spread throughout New Haven, causing a sensation, with everyone believing that this nightmare that had dragged on for years was finally about to end. However, just when everyone was preparing to celebrate, the case took another shocking reversal. The police awkwardly discovered that aside from the statement relayed by his ex-wife Melanie, they had absolutely no direct evidence that could prove Anthony had been at the crime scene. Secondly, the suspect described by witnesses back then was a thin, small-built young man, while Anthony was tall and strongly built, clearly not matching that description. Finally, when the police retested Anthony's blood type, they found that he was actually type A, and the subsequent fingerprint comparison also failed to match. Within just a few weeks, a case that had seemed ironclad collapsed once again. With no choice, the police had to drop the murder charges. Anthony was released, and the case was back to square one. In the years that followed, police reopened the investigation multiple times, but each time they left disappointed. The case fell completely silent. At this point, on the road to justice, only one lonely figure remained. John still unfailingly placed ads in the newspaper every year about his daughter's murder, and he still called the police station, reminding them in his aged voice, "Don't forget my daughter's case." This stubborn persistence was like a faint flame, barely keeping this case from being completely extinguished. Time came to 1987. A full 14 years had passed since the crime. Just when everyone had given up all hope on this blood case, a pivotal figure who would determine the direction of the entire case appeared. He was the renowned Chinese-American forensic scientist, Dr. Henry Lee. At that time, Dr. Lee was already well known in the field of American criminal forensics, and was serving as the director of the Connecticut State Police Forensic Science Laboratory. Since coming to Connecticut, he had heard about Penny's murder, and Penny's father John had also approached him for help. But Dr. Lee had been too busy with official duties at the time to attend to this long cold case. It wasn't until 1985 that a new technology capable of rewriting the entire history of criminal investigation began entering the American judicial system: DNA testing. In the past, police could only know what blood type a drop of blood belonged to, but couldn't confirm who exactly it came from. The advent of DNA made it possible to directly identify the owner of a blood sample for countless blood cases. This was the hope of seeing the light of day again. It was at this point that Dr. Henry Lee's team fully intervened in this case. After taking over, Dr. Lee did not rush to find a new suspect. Instead, he carefully reviewed the dusty case files from over the years and employed his signature technique, crime scene reconstruction. Many people didn't understand at the time. After all, the case was more than a decade old, so was it really necessary to reconstruct the scene now? But Dr. Lee believed that when a case was stuck in a dead end, turning one's gaze back to the very beginning might yield unexpected discoveries. On the 10th of September 1989, Dr. Lee led a team of detectives and crime scene experts to the Temple Street parking garage. The team reconstructed the entire crime process piece by piece based on photographs taken 16 years earlier, measurement diagrams, bloodstain records, and scene reports. As the bloodstain pattern analysis deepened, a clear picture gradually emerged. Dr. Lee deduced that Penny had parked her car on the 9th floor, and just as she was about to leave, the killer suddenly appeared, and the two engaged in a violent confrontation. During the struggle, she stabbed the killer's left hand with a knife, then desperately ran upstairs to escape, while the killer chased her all the way, which was why the trail of blood droplets extending to the 10th floor was left in the stairwell. This deduction perfectly matched the chase scene described by the witness back then. Penny was then caught up with on the 10th floor stairwell and brutally killed. Afterward, the killer rushed back to the 9th floor and attempted to steal the Buick, during which he used the tissue box to wipe up the blood, leaving behind a fingerprint. But when the car reached the 8th floor, he suddenly realized that if he left his own car in the garage, the police would quickly trace it back to him, so he hurriedly abandoned the Buick, pulled out the keys, and began searching for his own car. But because he was so panicked, he had actually forgotten which floor his car was parked on. He ran all the way down to the 5th floor before remembering that his car was probably on the 7th floor. He returned, and after getting into his own car, he casually discarded the Buick keys and the white handkerchief he had used to wipe off blood, then drove away to escape. Because his hands were bloody, he accidentally left blood marks on the parking ticket when exiting the garage, which was why the toll booth attendant received a damp, blood-colored parking ticket. Dr. Lee's textbook, Level Crime Scene Reconstruction, laid out the killer's psychological activities and escape route with seamless precision. But reconstruction could only answer how it happened, and still couldn't answer who did it. So Dr. Lee decided to test those sealed pieces of evidence again. Sure enough, during re-examination, several latent bloody fingerprints were discovered on the tissue box and on that parking ticket. So-called latent fingerprints are invisible to the naked eye and must be developed through physical or chemical methods. Unfortunately, most of these bloody fingerprints were unidentifiable, except for one on the tissue box that had been lifted very clearly. More critically, computer technology had made significant strides by this point, and fingerprint comparison no longer relied on cumbersome manual labor. A brand new automated fingerprint identification system had completely transformed traditional forensic methods. What used to take decades of manual comparison could now be run in just a few minutes after being entered into a computer. Dr. Lee entered this bloody fingerprint into the system with great hope, but regrettably, it did not match. The team couldn't help but feel somewhat dejected about this result. But Dr. Lee told everyone that as long as this real killer was arrested and fingerprinted for any reason in the future, as long as the database continued to grow, one day he would walk right into this net. Time proved he was right. The year in 1994 arrived, and 21 years had passed since the crime. On that day, when the police ran that bloody fingerprint through the system again for comparison, the computer displayed an alert. Fingerprint matched. The detective in charge of the case could hardly believe his eyes. To avoid any error, he immediately conducted a second comparison, and the result was the same. A third match, still the same. That bloody fingerprint that had been dormant for nearly 21 years had finally found its owner. The police immediately pulled up all the information on the owner of that fingerprint, and he was a 51-year-old man named Grant who had just been arrested for assaulting his fiancée and had his fingerprints entered into the system. Dr. Henry Lee's team was overjoyed at the news. The cold case that had haunted them for years was finally seeing a ray of hope. However, having learned the lesson from the Anthony incident, this time the police did not rush to make an arrest. Instead, they conducted a discreet investigation first. Grant was born in 1950 and had served in the military, but during his service, a serious drunk driving accident caused severe head trauma, leaving him with 4 steel plates still embedded in his skull to this day. This severe injury also gave him epilepsy and significant memory loss, and he was ultimately discharged from the military. After returning home, his personality became extremely volatile. It was precisely because of this that he beat his fiancée into the hospital and was fingerprinted. At the time of the crime, he had been just over 20 years old, thin and small-built, perfectly matching the witness descriptions of the suspect's physique. And his life and work at the time of the crime were entirely centered around downtown New Haven. In addition, the police compared his left thumbprint with the latent bloody fingerprint on the tissue box, and the result was a perfect match, and his blood type was also type O. Now all the clues matched up. However, fingerprint and blood type evidence alone were not enough to close the case. The next critical step, DNA testing, yielded no surprises. The bloodstains on the white handkerchief, the tissue box, and the car door handles all matched Grant's DNA perfectly. At this point, the case that had been delayed for decades was finally solved. Since the police wanted to further perfect the chain of evidence, verify the DNA, and prepare a large number of old pieces of evidence, this took nearly 5 years. It wasn't until the 24th of June, 1999, that the police formally arrested Grant on murder charges. On the day the news was announced, all of New Haven erupted. No one had ever imagined that a blood case sealed for 26 years could actually see the day it was solved. Because of the heinous nature and the extremely long span of the case, the court set bail at $1 million, an astronomical sum. But astonishingly, Grant managed to scrape together this enormous amount through his family's considerable wealth. posted bail, and was released. After all, the killer had been caught, and the evidence seemed solid. But for the police, the pressure was still immense. After all, the case was 26 years old, with no direct eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no clear motive. It was predictable that this trial would not be easy, and that was indeed the case. To ensure everything was airtight, the prosecution spent nearly 3 years preparing. On the 29th of April, 2002, the trial that had been delayed for 29 years finally commenced. The prosecutor first presented a complete timeline to the court, from the sweltering crime scene in 1973 to Dr. Henry Lee's re-examination of the evidence, to the automated fingerprint identification system's eventual identification of Grant. The entire investigation trail was like a giant jigsaw puzzle that had been assembled over nearly 30 years, finally revealing its full picture. Next, the police presented the evidence piece by piece. The most critical was naturally that blood-stained tissue box. It was the bloody fingerprint on it that irrefutably tied Grant to that Buick, and the subsequent DNA testing further confirmed that the blood on the tissue box and the white handkerchief did indeed belong to Grant. All the evidence was linked together, like an unbreakable chain, leading to only one conclusion: Grant was the killer. The defense, however, was no pushover either. They first threw a heavy punch, challenging that the murder indictment violated the 5-year statute of limitations law for murder cases that had been in effect since 1973. Then they followed up with another: the storage conditions at the Connecticut laboratory were questionable, and these key pieces of evidence, blood, fingerprints, the white handkerchief, had passed through too many hands over nearly 30 years and had long since degraded and been compromised, rendering them invalid as proof. Facing the defense's aggressive assault, Dr. Henry Lee personally took the stand to testify. He presented to the court in meticulous detail the entire crime scene reconstruction process, step by step reconstructing the trajectory of the killer's actions. To give the jury a more visceral understanding, the judge made an unusual decision. He took the entire jury to the Temple Street parking garage to walk the entire blood-stained path themselves. Dr. Lee clearly stated that the evidence had been well preserved and that the test results were completely reliable. The Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory determined that the probability that the blood DNA on the white handkerchief did not belong to Grant was less than 1 in 300 million. Yale University geneticists went even further. The probability it was not his was less than 1 in 6.9 trillion. After several days of hearings, the judge ultimately ruled that the chain of evidence was intact and that the DNA test results could be admitted. The defense's objections were overruled one by one. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a unanimous verdict. Grant was guilty of murder. Facing this outcome, Grant stated, "I am deeply sorry for the pain, grief, and loss that Penny's family has endured. I cannot begin to imagine what that must feel like. But this tragic event has nothing to do with me. However, the jury has found me guilty, and I ask for leniency. I have spent my whole life trying to make my family's life better." During the subsequent sentencing hearing, the judge directly pronounced Grant was guilty of murder, sentenced to 20 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. The judge also stated that this case could only be solved today because of the relentless persistence of Penny's family, because of the enormous amount of work done by the police officers on the day of the crime, and above all because of the advancement of technology. These few words captured precisely the full reasons why this case could finally be brought to a close. And with that, this murder case spanning nearly 3 decades finally came to its ultimate conclusion. Numerous American media outlets later considered this not only a victory in a murder case, but also a major triumph for modern forensic science. Dr. Henry Lee's use of bloodstain pattern analysis to reconstruct the crime scene provided the jury with intuitive, scientific, and highly compelling evidence, and also led more and more law enforcement agencies to place greater emphasis on physical evidence reconstruction technology. As Dr. Lee later said, "Witnesses may lie, suspects may remain silent, but physical evidence never lies. What truly tells the story of a crime is never the perpetrator, but the crime scene itself." However, while everyone was cheering for the case's resolution, fate left behind an irreparable regret. Penny's father, John, had sold his auto repair shop, which he had run for many years, after the case, and devoted the last 20-plus years of his life entirely to finding the killer. But fate cruelly played a devastating joke on him. In November 1998, just 8 months before Grant's formal arrest, John passed away from illness. On his deathbed, still unable to let go of his daughter's case, he called Dr. Henry Lee and left behind one sentence: "Don't forget my daughter." By that time, Dr. Lee had already identified Grant through that bloody fingerprint and had informed John of the result. But sadly, John ultimately never got to see the killer handcuffed with his own eyes, nor did he live to see the day the court finally handed down its verdict. Later, in an interview, Penny's sister Rosemary stood outside the courthouse, tears in her eyes, and said, "After all these years, our family can finally let go. How I wish my father could have stood here today and been with us to embrace this moment." That is the story for today. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. I will continue to bring you more fascinating case narrations. Your click of support is a great encouragement to me.